Good. Welcome, everyone. I'm John Henry, Chairman of the Committee for the Republic. The rule of law is king. The king is not law, was the battle cry of the American Revolution. The Constitution and the rule of law are the essence of our nation. In 1838, Abraham Lincoln elaborated, quote, "The patriots of 76 did to the support of the Declaration of Independence, so to the support of the Constitution and laws, let every American pledge his life, his property, and his sacred honor." End of quote. The Constitution's hope diamond is separation of powers. Separation of powers leaves no authority unchecked. Thomas Jefferson instructed, quote, "In questions of power, let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution," close quote. Our speaker tonight, Tom Hoenig, as president of the Federal Reserve of Kansas City, sat at the apex of our nation's monetary policy, the Federal Open Market Committee. The FOMC has limitless discretion to print money, set interest rates, and conduct a de facto industrial policy of underwriting the military-industrial complex and the housing market. Does the Federal Reserve and the Treasury operate outside the Constitution and the rule of law? Interesting question. Former Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson told the Washington Post during the 2008 financial crisis and the $700 billion TARP bailout, and I quote, "Even if you don't have the authorities, frankly, I didn't have authority for anything. If you take charge, people will follow," close quote. By thinking and acting on the merits, Tom Hoenig was a unicorn in the corridors of power. Our political class so often isn't dedicated to distinguishing between truths and untruths. What benefits partisan political ambitions is true, and what does the opposite is untrue. Like the Lebanese child response to the question of the sum of 2 plus 2, quote, am I buying or am I selling? Tom confirms that the Constitution never was a topic of consideration in the Fed's policy deliberations. With the ritual of semi-annual congressional briefings, the Fed acts as a philosopher king with no checks, no balances, and no accountability. The power of the Fed has grown so vast over the last century that its creators would be speechless. Opaque, internally contradictory statutory mandates operate like a directive to turn straw into gold, make prices stable, make employment soar, and the economy boom by whatever monetary policy seems fit. This constitutional lawlessness has spread like a cancer throughout our federal government, with the warfare state and the surveillance state as poster children. Enough of this talk about the Constitution. It's time for Tom to shine. Tom.
Well, thank you. First of all, John, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for showing up. I'm going to start by disclaimers. No, I do not have all the answers. In fact, I don't have many of the answers. No one else does either. That's the only thing that gives me comfort. But I tell you that in advance. But I do have strong views, and that's what I'm going to share with you this evening. And I want to talk about kind of the future and the challenges that lie ahead. But in doing that, I'm going to take a step back first and then come forward. John mentioned the Fed's kind of authority in terms of monetary policy. And I think it's very important to go back a little ways to 1971. I was in grad school, and I remember when the U.S. went off the gold standard as far as any backing to the dollar and any accountability with the dollar. It was really quite significant because we were, in fact, being disciplined by the world at that point. They had all these dollars because we were running deficits, and they wanted their money, which was gold. And that created a lot of stress within the economy. And so, and I don't know what the constitutionality of it was, but the president at that time, Richard Nixon, the chairman of the Fed, head of the Treasury, met and on a weekend and then announced on a Sunday that they were no longer on the gold standard. I don't know that any legislation was passed. I have no idea. But that really changed the dynamics of monetary policy and fiscal policy in a big way. Because now the only thing you had going for you was the discipline that the Congress imposed on itself and the discipline that the Open Market Committee imposed on itself. There's no external rule, no external discipline. And so since that period, we have increased our debt from some small 100 billion, I guess, to $31.5 trillion. We have increased the balance sheet of the Fed, which took 100 years to get to 900 billion and a decade plus to get to $9 trillion. And the Open Market Committee is a central planning body. I was a part of it, and we met, we thought, and we planned, and we took actions around that in terms of creating new reserves for banks or the printing of money. That was a huge change that we are now still experiencing. So now let's look forward, and we have a lot of discussion around the fragility of banks right now, but two things are ahead of us that I think are very important. Number one, we are running over $1 trillion new deficit, right? That's going to have to be financed. We'll see. That's ahead of us. And we have to refinance debt that's turning over, probably close to 25%. And that's coming up. And we have a debt ceiling limit, and there's a standoff. And that's kind of the sword over people's heads right now in Congress. I was very confident that that would settle. I'm not as confident now as I was, but it has to settle. But what discipline they can bring forward will be very important to that. I think it's a huge issue because Congress has no discipline other than itself. And it has proven to be rather shallow because we have now increased our spending from, even in 2019, our spending was only about $4.9 trillion. In 1 year, it went up by over 30% to $6.5 trillion. And then it stayed at $6.5 trillion. We're still there, and it's going to grow from here. And the debt has grown, and the interest on the debt will be over $1 trillion very soon. And the CBO projections that we talk about are frightening. Someone mentioned a speech I gave in 2010, and the number I gave as the risk is minuscule compared to what it is today. So we have that issue ahead of us, and we have to address it. If we don't start managing our budget and our spending, then the second issue comes up, and that's the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve has many issues that it has created for itself. Its quantitative easing program, which I objected to strenuously, continued. I only got to say no to the QE2, and from that we had QE3, QE4, and in 2019, when there was a spike in the repo market interest rates, the Fed introduced QE again. Now, they don't call it that, but that's what it was. They increased They printed money at the rate of $60 billion a month from September 2019 to March of 2020, when it doubled. So the Federal Reserve has been a what I call an enabler of the fiscal policies that the government has followed. Because had the Fed said, no, we're not doing QE again, no, we're not going to monetize debt, it would have forced the Congress to take action. Now, whoever the chairman was would have been slaughtered on a daily basis, but that's what their job was and is today. And they will face that again after the debt ceiling crisis settles out, because they will have to be, think about it, you're going to have to, the Treasury is going to have to issue over $1 trillion in new debt and refinance debt. And the Fed says it's shrinking its balance sheet. Okay, it was 9 trillion. It's going to come down from there. And so they're not going to be buying that debt. That means the private sector has to buy it. That puts upward pressure on interest rates. You have the famous crowding out issue, and they'll have to deal with that. And the pressure on the Fed is ahead. You think it's bad now, it's ahead, and it's going to be worse. So those are two issues that are on the horizon that the Congress has to take responsibility for. If it doesn't, I think we will see the debt go up even more, and they'll put more pressure on the Fed, and then the Fed will have to step up, and that's not been its record. It has not stepped up in decades. So that's one issue. The other issue the Federal Reserve has to face is we have, I think, a financial system right now that is highly fragile. I know, and I wish I could say it, that everything is calm. We have this behind us. We're going to go forward. Don't worry. Well, here's how I look at that. You have, broadly first, right? You have, when you are dealing with this issue, you have the Federal Reserve trying to finance this debt without increasing their role in it. It can't be done, all right? You have a banking system that's highly fragile, and you're going to hold steady. But what if, okay, when the risk-free assets you have, the credit risk-free assets you have, called government securities and mortgage-backed, have in them over $600 billion of loss, unrealized loss, but loss nevertheless, that's sitting there. There's no liquidity in that, because once you sell $1 of that, you write it all off. So they have that issue in front of them, and they know it. But that's just part of it. That's the credit risk-free part. The industry is $23 trillion in size, and it has just experienced a 20-fold increase in interest rates. How many of those assets on their balance sheet are at par? So the unrealized loss in that balance sheet is much greater than 600 billion. And what are we going to do about that when the pressure starts to build and people begin to say, how's this going to work? Where can I put my money that's safe? With that, I am told often, very often, and if you're from a major, one of the largest 8 banks in this country, you probably will be offended with what I say, but the fact of the matter is, the largest banks you keep hearing are well capitalized. It's not a problem. They're the ones that they went through the pandemic without a scratch. There was no threat there. The Fed stepped in well before they had any real pressure on them. So now you have a different situation. So what are they going to do? All right. If the interest rates stay up like this and you start seeing this fall, they're going to have major unrealized, and then the realized losses start. Will they stand by, or will they intervene? The Fed's history over the last decade and a half has to intervene. It doesn't stand by. So that means we're going to have another round of QE, or we're going to have a major recession. And we're already hearing about the commercial real estate and real estate portfolios in these banks. They're under severe pressure. We see PIMCO, one of its subsidiaries, owns office buildings around the country, went into bankruptcy. There are others out there. And then what's behind that? So we have these issues. The Fed has they don't have the ability to resist that. So they're going to be under a lot of pressure to come back in and do QE, and soon, right? I'm told, well, it's calm. Well, I remind people, in 2008, Bear Stearns happened in March. Everything was very quiet, very settled until August. Fannie and Freddie got through that, bailed out, and then with that, you set the expectation. We bail out. Then Lehman's comes, we disappoint the expectation, and we have a major crisis. So here we are now. We have assets underwater. We got through Silicon Valley and Signature. Everything's calm, but I don't think they're going to stay calm forever. And I hope the Fed's thinking about what it's going to do as we go forward from here. I'm told, as I said earlier, that the largest banks are very well capitalized, no problem. Well, here's what I tell people. If you look at the 8 largest banks' capital, they have about 900 billion of capital, equity. They have about $14 trillion of assets. Of the 900 billion, if you look at their unrealized losses and their hold to maturity, it's 300 billion approximately, a third of their capital. If you look behind that, then say what other assets? They got derivatives, highly leveraged business. They have other assets. Maybe you have another 200 to 300. Let's say it's just 500 billion. That leaves you 400 billion. That leaves you a little short on capital, like 3%, or in terms of equity to assets. The bank analysts will figure that out if, in fact, these have to start being reported as the analysts look at it carefully. We'll see what the reaction to that is. Now, the advantage that these largest banks have is what? Too big to fail. That's their capital. And that's the subsidy we provide them for the stability of the financial system. The regional banks have about 40% more capital now in terms of the nominal numbers, and yet they're considered unsafe. If you had no assurances that anyone would be bailed out, those largest banks would be under the same pressure as the regional banks. So that's another issue the Fed has to go, because if people start figuring that out, that means they will have to step in, all the more certain of it. So that's why I worry about the future in terms of the Fed's policy, fiscal policy as we go forward. One other thing. When Silicon Valley went, there was a rush of deposits out of the regional banks to the larger banks and to the mutual funds. The run to the mutual funds has been in place for a year because they pay higher interest. Deposits don't pay that kind of interest, so you've seen a major transfer of funding, short-term funding, from the commercial banks to the money market funds. About 800 billion over a year. More recently, 200 to 300 billion, depending on what your start date is. And that's probably going to continue unless the industry starts raising its rates they're willing to pay to retain some of that capital, some of that funding for themselves. And that's another issue you have, because that's going to compress margins, especially in the times right now where you're not growing your loan portfolio. So you see all this coming at you, and the thing is, what do you do about it? How do you do it? Well, I don't have a shall we say, an elegant solution to this. It's going to be painful. Think Volcker, because that's what it's going to take. You've got inflation, it's coming down with a 20-fold increase in rates. I don't know if they're going to raise rates any further. There's talk that there will be. If you look at real interest rates, they're barely zero. So there's a case to be made for that against the issue of financial stability. I think I think it's a question mark. And I think the next FOMC meeting in May is going to be one tough meeting for who's ever chairman, Jay Powell, because there are going to be two groups arguing for an increase or against it. One because inflation is their primary, the other because they're worried about financial stability right now. And how they come to agreement on that, I really don't know. And the last thing I want to say, and then I want to just see what questions you have, but this all began with quantitative easing. And quantitative easing, even before that, the Greenspan put was the start of it. When you intervene in the markets and you bail out, you create the expectation of bailout. And when you disappoint, then you get even worse outcomes and you end up going back in. And that's what I say, that part of it has to end, and I don't see how it can, given the fragility of the economy right now and the fragility of the banking system and the unwillingness or the inability of this country withstanding that kind of pressure. Now, what are some of the other effects of this? The social effects. People talk about it. I witnessed it. If you see the largest banks in the country in 2008 being bailed out, what do you expect for yourself? If they're going to get it, you have a right to. It builds a loss of shared sacrifice. If you favor some over others, you get a loss of shared sacrifice, and therefore you divide the country. And that's pretty much what we've done. And I'd say whoever that leader is, has to say that the hard part is we cannot go on as we have. We're going to learn to face up to it now, or we're going to make it a lot worse. And people say, well, and I do. I say, so I refer to Argentina. I say, that could be your roadmap if you don't start paying attention to this. Repeating inflation, coming back. So you have to have a leader that says, and the hardest part is you've got to convince the American people that there's a shared sacrifice that we can use and get through this and have something at the end that is far more stable, more stable currency. We need a rule of some form to discipline ourselves, more stable currency, a more stable industrial system, and a much more stable financial system for the long run. If we don't do that, then I think the 70s was a preview of what we're going to have in the rest of this decade into the next decade. So on that cheery note, I'm going to stop, and I'm happy to take questions. Sure, right here.
Tom, you wrote in the paper you mentioned, 2010 paper about, I think it was entitled Congress Knocking on Fed's Door, that the Congress is sort of forcing the Fed's hand by borrowing so much money. And right now the Congress itself, well, the Congressional Budget Office expects us to borrow about $2 trillion a year for the next 10 years. And you had mentioned in your paper that we sort of have three options, and the worst one was to monetize essentially all this money we're borrowing. And it seems like there's been a pretty strong vote for that, even though I agree with you, I think you're right. It just seems to me that the Congress has basically said, yeah, we'll go ahead and just monetize it. In fact, I think I mentioned to you earlier that one of the figures that the Congressional Budget Office said that we'd hit in 2035 in terms of debt versus GDP actually got hit this year, 15 years ahead of schedule. So it seems like to me the Congress has voted, and to some degree so has the Fed. What do you think is going to happen going forward?
Well, if they continue down that path, we're going to have, I think, renewed inflation. We'll have both, and remember, you and I have talked about it. My definition of inflation is asset and price inflation, goods and services. So we are going to have renewed inflation. I think we're going to have, as that increases, we'll have greater social instability, because you cannot maintain an industrial country in that forever. It undermines, for example, your ability to invest is complicated or made more complex, right? Because you don't know what your cost of goods are going to be, so you have to guess at it. And that is a very shall we say, dicey even under the best of circumstances. So I think we're going to suffer greatly if we continue to do this, and we will sow the seeds of social instability far greater than what we have today.
Well, let me add, I live in Washington, D.C., and not in Kansas City, unfortunately. But in D.C., it does seem like the Congress is heading in that direction. And frankly, that seems to be a bipartisan agreement.
The thing about it is that, yes, I think you're right. They do actually do what the people want.
Sure.
They don't lead, they don't explain, because here's the issue. I've talked to groups all over this country, and when I say to them, do you agree we need to address this debt problem and this deficit? And almost always they do. And then I say, all right. and if I'm speaking to an ag group, I say, so we're going to cut the subsidies down for ag. Oh my God, we can't do that. No. And then I remember housing. I mean, the buckle back from housing. Think about green energy right now. What would be your kickback on that? So what you need is someone to say, yes, we have to, these are all important things. We've got to, number one, all share in the adjustment, and we have to prioritize. And that's where the debate, not how much do we spend, but how do we prioritize what we have for spending. And if we don't do that, then I think we are in trouble. So, yeah.
Tom, thank you for being here. I have a question with regard to some of the recent banking problems. I've done a deep dive into the numbers on Silicon Valley Bank and lesser so on the other failures. The thing that struck me about Silicon Valley is it essentially had a business model that was comparable to the S&Ls, the classic S&Ls of the 1980s, of borrowing very short, particularly with a lot of what effectively were checkable deposits, and then investing in long-term mortgage-backed securities and other long-term debt. My question is this. Silicon Valley, both the bank and the holding company are regulated by the Fed. And the FDIC, of course, is regulated by virtue of being its deposit insurer. Why did the supervisors at the Fed and the FDIC allow Silicon Valley Bank to get as overextended from a maturity standpoint as it did? Why did they let that maturity mismatch, that extreme maturity mismatch, get to the point that it did and continue as long as it did?
For the same reason they let about 200 other banks do the same thing. They weren't paying attention they were focused on getting inflation down, moving it, and they weren't paying. I mean, there's no other explanation. They were not carrying out their mission. Pardon? Well, FDIC wasn't the primary supervisor, and it's washed its hands from that. Malpractice is fair, because in November, I mean, there were conversations going on, because I was talking to the Wall Street Journal at the time and looking at the unrealized losses and saying, this is what this does is say you have no liquidity there. It's gone, right? Because you can't sell $1 if you hold a maturity without a disaster happening. And that's why I get upset with the largest banks. They moved all their available for sale into their hold to maturity, so that stuff's tied up. And it's something that the Fed, I cannot understand why they didn't anticipate that and start saying, of course they incented behavior, didn't they? I mean, they went a decade with near zero interest rates. They got all the way to 2.25, and then someone threw a tantrum and they went back down. So you incent the behavior, and then you're going to anticipate it when you start raising rates. You should have, but that wasn't there. That wasn't where their focus was, I'm afraid. It's too bad. But I think it's, the same. I asked this question: how, in 2010, when you started QE, and this was my question, if you think far enough in the future, where does this lead? And no one wanted to think about that. So, yes.
Hi, Dave Walker, former Comptroller General of the United States. First, I want to congratulate you and thank you for your promotion of fiscal and monetary discipline over the years, although you were a minority in doing that, okay? 3 specific questions. Do we need a constitutional amendment that will limit how much debt as a percentage of the economy we can take on? Because Congress is out of control and statutory approaches have failed and will continue to fail. Number 2, should we eliminate the employment mandate from the Fed? The Fed should focus on promoting macroeconomic growth and maintaining stable prices. Frankly, the Congress is the one that has more to do with employment than the Fed does. Right. And thirdly, should there be a limit on the ability of the Fed to directly purchase Treasury securities, thereby enabling irresponsible fiscal behavior and monetizing the debt?
Yes to the last one. Direct purchase, now, actually, what they're doing right now is indirect purchases. They buy from the bank, but they should have limits on how much. Right. They're going to have to buy some kind of an asset, right? We're not on the gold standard. They're going to have to buy some kind. So they probably ought to be limited to very short term, and there ought to be some kind of a limit on how much they can accumulate in a given period of time. So, and then to your second constitutional amendment, they need some kind of discipline. It used to, and I keep telling people, I'm not for the gold standard necessarily, but I've learned the more you deny that you're for, again, you say I'm not for that, you probably are for it, but they need some kind of discipline. So they're not going to do the gold standard. They need some kind of limit on their ability to spend without having to make choices. And that's the problem right now. And your first question?
Yeah, no, the second was the employment. Should the Fed focus on macroeconomic growth, the mandate, and stable prices?
Yes.
And then get rid of the employment, because that's really more education policy, immigration policy, welfare policy. That's not the Fed.
If I had my druthers, I'd say the Fed's role is stable prices.
Yeah, totally agree.
Period.
Totally agree.
Because then everything else, Congress is really in charge of growth. I mean, how many regulations do you impose on your economic system? How much stimulus do you give your economic system? Those are the things Congress does. The Fed, what they want to do is give stable prices. If you slow your economy arbitrarily by rate, then you create deflation. Yes. Just as you overstimulate, create inflation. That should be your guide. And I think they would be much better off for doing that. Yeah. Yes.
So we're running this experiment. The questions are, how many questions are we up to now? Okay. Why don't you take a look at these, Tom, and see how much overlap there is. Well, Pat, let's see if we can get Alex. Can we get Alex now, or is it on Alex's end? Try again. Let's try Alex again.
Okay. I like these questions. Okay, the first question is, since the largest banks are still too big to fail, doesn't this mean the basic intent of Dodd-Frank has already failed? Yes. First of all, there are parts of Dodd-Frank that I think are useful. They're straightforward rules. The rest has made the regulatory agencies legislative bodies themselves rather than the Congress. And I'll give you an example, living wills. I just hate living wills because I've had to read them. And they are thousands of pages of almost incomprehensible discussions of what they're going to do if they have a problem that no one can anticipate, what their board is going to do to declare bankruptcy in the holding company so you can do a orderly liquidation authority action. No one pays attention to them. The regulators don't pay any attention to them. Not when you have a crisis, right? You do what you have to do. Just like we did with Silicon Valley. They didn't take any liquidation authority in and take the holding company. They bailed out all the uninsured depositors again. So, and what it did is, here's what really bugs me. It put higher, you think about the cost of the regulation, living wills, the stress tests and all this. It disproportionately affects the regional and smaller banks because you don't have the assets to spread the cost over. It's a fixed cost. mostly a fixed cost. And therefore you advantage the largest, disadvantage the smallest. And our strength of this country has been our mid-tier banks and our smaller banks. So I would seriously, now there's zero chance of this, but I would seriously revamp Dodd-Frank, get down to the simple rules. And I've told, the one common theme I have whenever I talk to people, having spent a lot of years, is I want the rules simple, understandable, and enforceable. Simple, understandable. That's a new concept in regulations of banking. And enforceable, okay? And if we could do that, I think do a lot for the health of the industry. And I want the capital high. And I don't think the largest banks, they use this risk-weighted stuff. It's very misleading. If you look at their risk-weighted assets, which they'll quote, it's 14%. You look at their leverage ratio, it's around 6.5%, 7%. You look at the regionals, their leverage ratio is around 10%, 9.5%. Okay, some are down to 8%, but you need capital to absorb the shock that you didn't anticipate. And think about Silicon Valley. It actually had about 5% tangible capital. If they had to fund it at 15 cents for every new dollar, they would have grown a lot slower, and they would have had to invest it a lot more carefully because it's harder to raise the capital to do so. So that's my view on Dodd-Frank.
Hey, John.
Is this a U.S. or global problem? It's a global problem, right? I mean, we in Europe's every bit as foolish as us, or maybe a little more since they had negative nominal rates. And I think it's hurting them as it's hurting us. And I think that's very important. Japan has their own issues, but it's similar. They've had QE for a long time. And I remember talking years ago to a former vice chair of the Bank of Japan. And in 1999, when their bubble burst, he gave this wonderful talk. And he said, we did not have price inflation. So we didn't feel we could raise interest rates, but we knew we had asset inflation, but we didn't raise interest rates. Then the bubble pops and we have this mess and we can't get out of it. He said, I think the US is right behind us. And that was his concern, and I thought it was very insightful on his part. So we are in a global, and I think that's part of the reason we're nationalizing. We're looking internally now. A global market is becoming less of a priority. Now we still have it, but it's less of a priority. And I keep telling people who tell me that, well, the U.S. has to take care of its trade deficit. It's terrible. And I say, well, remember, there's one thing you have to do to get rid of a trade deficit. What is it? You got to produce more than you consume. That's not something that the U.S. takes very seriously, does it? So I think it's a big problem going forward.
Yeah, that is exactly the issue I wanted to talk with you about. I'm a lawyer, but not an economist, but I spent 15 years up there on the staff of the U.S. Senate Banking Committee. And I remember the formula for GDP includes the term net exports. When there are negative net exports, they detract from GDP and job growth in your country, my understanding.
Right.
Last year, we ran a $1 trillion trade deficit in manufactured goods. Over the last probably 20 years, we've probably run at least $10 trillion worth of trade deficits.
Right.
How is the issue that we're talking about tonight related to the reserve currency, which permits us to run these massive and ongoing trade deficits, which I think are impoverishing the middle class in this country?
Yeah, that's one of the major arguments. Well, the fact of the matter is, you have to start again to some degree with monetary policy. If in our country, you keep interest rates low and you encourage consumption, and we import cheap labor from China from other parts of the world. So,
We import the cheap labor and the goods. they're
and the
sending.
goods, and the
Yes.
goods, yeah, basically, that's what you're doing, right?
Yes.
And you ship your dollars over, they buy your debt. And the reason you can do that is you are the reserve currency. And, that can be an advantage unless you, like all advantages, unless you abuse it. And we're abusing it.
Yes.
And we have abused it. And so we are trading our future, okay? And it's also tied to the fact that we run such large deficits internally. So when you spend, and that's your primary goal, and you're spending more in the United States, the government is.
I have one more thing I want you
Sure.
to comment on. My understanding is when we send these dollars, say to China, to get the goods they're sending us, that they use some of those dollars to buy our debt.
Right?
So they own our debt. Now, as we increase interest rates on that debt, the outflow of money to China, regardless of the trade deficit, is going to increase quite rapidly. Is that a correct understanding?
Right.
That's a disaster for the country.
Well, keep building your debt. It's like, I know I always get chastised when I say it's like an individual. If you use your credit card to some degree, fine. If you abuse it, you go bust. And we have a credit card. It's called the reserve currency. And if we use it to extent, we undermine our own productivity, and we have to pay the piper. We will, the reason we stay the reserve currency, as I tell people, the best description I have is we're the least dirty shirt in the laundry. So if that changes, then our ability to do that, and then if we lose a reserve status, then we will suffer greatly, because we'll have to adjust to these external factors much more quickly. And that may be our discipline, if we have it. So, yep.
There are so many things I'd like to comment on, but I'm going to comment on one after making one quick footnote. The Fed supervisors did flag the excess leverage of the bank,
Silicon Valley?
Silicon Valley Bank, but the management decided not to do anything about it. So there's an issue here of enforcement and so on. But the real major issue and weakness of our banking system, from which almost all of the things you're saying flow, that I want to flag, is what's called fractional reserve banking, which means that the money you take and deposit at the
Right.
bank that you think is money, it's callable, you can take it and pay for things anytime you want, is being lent for 5, 10, 30 years for mortgages and for other things. So that's it's the financing of bank credit with short-term deposits,
Sure.
which is the source of so many of these problems. Banks runs only exist because of that. You don't run on the equity you hold in a company. You're riding the risk with them. You might find somebody else who will buy it from you, but you
Right,
can't withdraw it.
Right.
It's a totally different way of financing. And so our banking system has created the most fragile way of financing possible by mixing what should be solid, sound money, fully backed, with long-term credit.
Right.
So, but to tie that off, some University of Chicago professors many years ago proposed that bank deposits should be 100% reserved. They should not be lent out. It's called the Chicago Plan.
Right.
And actually, the central bank digital currency that's being discussed these days is a form of the Chicago Plan,
Right.
the retail version of it, if it's done properly.
Yeah. Now, to your point, you have to kind of separate things out too, and that is, an economic system grows on leverage, like so many things. In other words, capital, you borrow the money, you build it, you pay it back. If you don't over leverage, you can do that. The problem is we tend to over leverage. And that's, I think, been the problem and made worse because we don't have any early rule check from that. So in capitalism, you know, the fact that you can borrow allows your economy to grow more quickly. But when you over leverage, you tempt fate in that sense. And I'll give you back to my point. Anyone who knows me knows that every time I have a conversation, I say, we need more capital in these banks so that the investor, first of all, it'll help address liquidity. Second of all, it gives you more time when you do have a shock to solve the problem before the insolvency takes on. Number three, if it's sufficient capital, it tells the public who have your deposits that you can absorb that shock, and so you don't have the run necessarily. But over time, the industry, because there is advantages to leverage, like return on equity, goes up when you can grow your top dollar by new products, but very slowly. But boy, can you move your ROE up when you lever up. So you have to get that back under control. And you can't have things like risk-weighted capital that misleads. It's got to be, here's how much tangible capital I have against my assets. And I have to deploy my capital across whatever uses to make sure this stays stable. And if I fail, it doesn't have to be systemic then because I have more investor funds who can't run. And that's the other side of that. Now, you can do 100%, but you'd have to do it on demand deposits because you'd find out other deposits, other kinds of ways to say that, money markets and so forth. So, yep. Yes, wherever. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Dr. Myrtle Alexander, Institute for Academic Management. Due to the fact that the future generations are set to inherit a rather dire and dismal financial future, what are your top 3 recommendations for we the people to counter the national debt by way of academia and industry starting today?
Well, number one, you have to get priorities straight. So you have to get the inflation down, right? You have to get the financial industry more stable. You have to get the national debt under control, right? Because you can't be growing that and spending money because it takes away from the private sector, especially if you're not going to print it. And you better not be printing it, otherwise you might as well forget the rest. So you have to get your national debt under control. So now you have a stable currency, have a national debt, then you have to, I think we really do need to, rules and regulations are very important. They give you the rule of the road is extremely important. Congress needs to do that. We need to make sure it's, shall we say, a rule of law rather than a rule of regulation to the extent possible, so that you can increase your productivity. The only way to raise wealth in a nation is through increased productivity. If you just print dollars, you're going to make some people wealthy and some people not, right? Because it's arbitrary. It's not something done by the innovative nature of this economy or these people. It's done by you get it and you don't. So you've got to get that addressed. And if you do, I think we have a great industrial economy. Now, here's the other thing I do want to point out to you. If you don't address it, you don't crash overnight and never recover. What happens is the growth rate of your economy slows systematically over time. So when you had a decade of 3% real GDP growth, it becomes 2 3/4, and then 2.5. And if you do a future analysis of a 25 basis point reduction in the growth rate over one generation and the wealth that you've given up for that generation, it's mind-boggling. It just strikes you. And that's what I'm most worried about. It's not, I don't expect my grandchildren to be in rags, but I do expect them to be less well off than this generation. And that's not the way this country's worked in the past. So that's why I worry about it a great deal. Yeah.
I'd like to ask two questions. One, as an employee of the biggest bank in the world, considered a TBTF in 2007-9,
Yeah.
a Citigroup, what if you would let it fail? What about financial stability in that case? Second, I take it you want the Fed to remain independent. The regional Fed's councils are largely made up of bankers. Don't you think there should be some distance between the regional Feds and the banking system?
First of all, on the Citibank, had it failed, it would have been a mess. There's no question. I know they had offices around the world. They had all this going on because they were too big. My proposal was not to break them up necessarily by size, but get the investment banking stuff and get the high risk stuff back separate. Because, we've had investment banks fail, large ones. We've had large banks fail in the earlier period and not the end of the world come, but you couldn't do it anymore by then. And that's true of the largest banks today. So that gives me, but let me tell you, I brought that up and that was dead before I could step out of the doorway. So that's not going to happen. And so now we have too big to fail. So what I keep arguing is you have to internalize more of the subsidy by requiring more capital. So that now you bring some more of the liquidity issues on the stockholders, more of the asset issues on the on the stockholders, and you at least internalize some of that subsidy so that it is not as egregious. Because now it's just rent seeking, and the rest of the world sees that. I mean, the rest of the country sees that. The middle class sees that, and they're offended by it.
There was another solution proposed by one of the founders of the committee, and he said TBTJ, too big to jail.
Well, I know, but someone asked me that question, and I said, if failure is a crime in America, we have a lot of trouble ahead of us, because we have always been an entrepreneurial country, and failure is part of entrepreneurship. Now, can big firms be entrepreneurial? Absolutely they can, and they can fail at it. Now, if they had enough capital, they could fail at different ventures without bringing the whole institution down. That's why capital becomes so much more important. But at 6%, it's nowhere near enough. Before we had the Fed, and before we had the controller, to your point, about half of the bank's funding was equity. Not 6%, 50%. And then the Fed came in and went down, FDIC came in and went down, and so we create the moral hazard issue, it gets worse, and that's really part of it. To the second point on the regionals. First of all, I'm from the region, and I want to tell you, and I say this with all due respect for people in this room, but I have seen, some of the choices to head agencies. A lot of it is, who do you know, in terms of, did I work for this senator or not? At the region, when you have a new president, you do a national search. Now, some of them come from inside. I was from inside. But you have actually 9 directors at those regional banks. 3 are bankers, and they can play no role in selecting the president. They have no role, in fact, it's against the law. So you have 6 who are from industry, commerce, consumer, labor. They do the search. Then they take their candidate, who they've selected, and it goes to the Board of Governors, and it can be vetoed. So the government-appointed individual can veto that. They have the say. Not the Senate, I realize, and perhaps that's one of the things you could look at. But the fact of the matter is, I don't think that has been a fatal flaw by any means.
Would you agree the Fed should remain independent?
I think the Fed. Yes, I think the Fed should not only remain independent on the books, but in reality, too. And it's not independent. if you are reacting to every crisis the way we have, and you react in a way that serves the interest of Congress, even when you know it's not in the interest of the country, you're not independent anymore. You may say you are, but you're not acting that way. And I, for the life of me, think that, that's where the accountability part comes. Now, when the country had a outside external disciplinarian, you couldn't get away with that very long. But now we don't have that. So, I mean a gold standard. Yeah. Right, because what happens is people want their money, and the universal money is gold at that point, not anymore. Yes.
Thank you. It's my recollection of the last decade that the consensus on public debt transformed substantially, where after the Eurozone crisis, people were reluctant to take on large amounts of debt. And now, as long as the borrowing rate is below the growth rate, so economists say, then you can borrow indefinitely. That was all in the span of the time of a decade.
Right.
I'm wondering if you have ever thought about what the next decade could bring on the view of debt. And I have a second question, whichever one you have a stronger opinion on, please. What do you think went on in the boardroom over the last 2 years as the inflation prints went higher and higher? And if it was a private company, I'm sure there would have been a post-mortem ordered immediately. Analysts would have been fired and so on. And what do you think actually went on in there? And do you think that there's been sufficient reckoning, changes to the models and the forecast method?
I'm going to guess, given my experience of 20 years, that it was never talked about, right? That's behind us. We think forward now. What are we going to do next quarter? And there was no interest in doing a postmortem at that point. I mean, has anyone done a postmortem on QE1, QE2, QE3, QE4, QE5? No. So I don't think that's in the game. I think we go forward. How can you explain? I can't, and I'm not. It's critical, but I don't mean it as mean. Just a kind of a fact. When in October of 2020, you say we have an inflation problem. It's not transitory, and you don't actually raise your first rate until March of 2022. I don't understand that. And I don't have an explanation for it. I wasn't in the room. I was in the room when we did QE in 2010. And there was one of my critiques of the Fed today versus past, even when Volcker was there, other members of the committee gave him a hard time. And I think over time, it evolved to your duty on the FOMC is to support the chairman. And your duty is to be part of a consensus that gives the markets confidence that everything is good because you all agree. And I thought that was a terrible way of doing things because it means you think people are dumb. I mean, and they're not. They know that this isn't, even amongst themselves, they don't agree. So they know you can't all agree in that room. So I think it's just part of the culture that has evolved, but I don't think there is postmortems going. And now I've already forgot your first question. So
On how much the view of debt transformed in the last 10 years.
here's my thought on that. I have been through more than one crisis. And here's the sequence. Recovery, debt increases, that's wonderful. More debt's even more wonderful. Crash, oh, that's terrible. Recovery, debt increases, that's good. A little more debt's wonderful. That's really wonderful. Crash, start over. So we're gonna, if we have, and I hope we don't, but if we have a financial crisis, And companies suffer from it as well, because this country and the globe is as leveraged as you can make it, I think. And so there'll be a reaction to that, and leverage will come out of favor for a while, and then people will forget. That's the cycle.
Okay. Hello.
Who else?
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. In the question list there, I listed 5 issues that you didn't get a chance to discuss. You only have so much time. One of the de-dollarization around the world. Half the world is de-dollarizing with a vengeance right now. You didn't get a chance to discuss that. The deindustrialization of the United States, whereby nowadays, as time goes on, China now produces twice as much industrial output as the United States, and the change is getting worse. You didn't get a chance to discuss that. Number 3, the energy thing. China now consumes over 20 to 25. I can't keep up. 20 to 25% more energy than the United States. That's why even Saudi Arabia and OPEC and all that are shifting over to China and all that stuff. You didn't get a chance to discuss that. I understand. Then there's the issue of the difficulty in bringing back jobs. We had a president who tried. I won't go into that. But anyway, and then of course the difficulty is just, I consider almost unsurmountable. But anyway, then because of the legal framework and the litigation and so on and so forth, and also the demographic trends, which are not our friends, the way I look at it. But again, these are taboo subjects, so I won't touch it because I'm.
Sorry, and you want me to do so?
No, I won't. No. And the last thing I mentioned is that the IMF had a study of 19 countries who had hyperinflation over the past since 1960. 19 countries that had hyperinflation, and the 4 main criteria they identified were actually present in the United States right now as we speak. Sure. So anyway, I won't go into that. My question to you is, how do dollars come back to the United States? What happens when the euro dollars and other dollars circulating in the world basically get repatriated here to us? Thank you.
Well, yeah, I was going to say they are repatriated. They finance our debt, and we become more dependent on that until we decide to address it. And part of the issue will be how much do we onshore? Do we rebuild our own industrial site? And do I promote industrialization, central planning for industrialization? I do not. But I think if we change the incentives, we can, I think, promote a rebound in our own growth rate. That's the one thing about capitalism. It is self-healing if it's given a chance. And that's what I think we can do. So to all your points. Now, digitalization, that's technology. That's moving forward. I'm not a fan of central bank digital currency for a host of reasons. But I think we will have even more digitalization through the banking system. FedNow, which has its own controversies, will actually support further digitalization of the payment system itself. So we're behind, but we'll probably catch up. So.
Tom, we're going to try Alex again and see if we can.
You are most kind, John. I think I'm on now.
Yes.
Hey, Alex.
Your central control made it so that I could not unmute myself every time I tried. A nice message that said, I'm not allowed to do that.
And I didn't pay him anything to do it, I promise.
Let me just say, those were terrific comments, and thank you very much for most interesting and obviously highly knowledgeable comments. I want to say I completely agree with you that the 1971 end of Bretton Woods and going off gold was the most important financial event in the world since the end of World War II. Right. And it had all the effects you said. I call it created a Nixonian world monetary system. And we're all Nixonians now because of it. And it has the non-controllable effects you said, including that the central banks, and as you well know, I think about it as a club of central banks, and they're all in it together, did precisely what you said, which was create a huge asset price inflation or everything bubble, and led the banking systems into the problems we have now. So now when we get the inevitable deflation with the terrific marks to market, which really mean future losses, that you said, it's paying the cost, as I see it, of the asset inflation led by the central bank. So what are we going to do now? As you said, will we have intervention? I think you're right. Central banks and treasuries always intervene when pushing comes to shoving. That could be another QE. And my question is, could there be another TARP? When the banking system runs out of capital, not having built up enough of it, as you said, are we going to have recapitalization by the government, a new TARP, Roman numeral 2?
I think it is a real risk. If any one of the, in two ways, if any one of the largest were to become perceived as insolvent or likely to be insolvent, I think we would do a TARP type of intervention. Or if we had a systemic around the regionals, we would have a TARP intervention. The smaller banks will be P&A'd. That's how we'll take care of that. And if the FDIC runs out of money, we'll do a TARP for them, right? Or they'll assess what's left of the banks like they did last time in advance, which may be harder this time to do. I don't know. But yeah, I think there's a real risk if we do that. And I mean, I can't, like I say, if I look at the largest banks, I look at the whole banking industry, and I see a third of their capital tied up in unrealized losses. And that's just for the credit risk-free assets. And I just think there's not enough capital. I mean, if we have a serious recession, I think we will have to have some kind of a printing press again. And that's what scares me. We're in this habit and we don't seem to learn from it. So there's no, why, and of all things that come out of the great financial recession was modern monetary theory. I mean, what a terrible, I couldn't have wished for a worse outcome than that. People are seriously taking that. And so hopefully if we do this again, some other answer will come up and they'll say, wait a minute, we need to impose some discipline on ourselves. And if we did, I think we'd onshore more goods or more of our own manufacturing. I don't know that we would, but I wouldn't be afraid of an open market, a global open market in that case. But when it's too easy to buy from someone else with a credit, you usually do give up the future. So.
Thank you.
Tom, I have one more question I wanted to ask you.
Sure.
This is not, I know you're not a geopolitical expert, but
I am not.
But I'm looking at it and I look at these massive budget deficits year after year. If we didn't do this and we had some discipline, would this discipline our foreign policy to engage in wars like Iraq and Afghanistan that cost the country trillions and trillions of dollars?
Right.
Do you think that would be some restraint on our ability to engage in all these foreign wars?
Well, I think it would, wouldn't it? I mean, Vietnam was an example, right? We were fighting it. We were spending.
That's what brought 71 of us.
That's exactly right. So yeah, you would force yourself, and that's what I mean. I'm not going to say you should or shouldn't have go to engage.
But it should be a factor.
But no, I'm not saying you shouldn't, but what's your priorities? Is this so important that you are willing to spend money and take away, guns and butters trade-off from something else or not? You can't have it both ways. And is it so important that you're willing to temporarily go into debt? And will the people be satisfied with that? I mean, World War II is an example, as opposed to something. So yeah, it forces you to make hard choices. And hard choices, when you avoid them, as we tried to do, then you get worse outcomes. And that's what I think, that's what worries me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
If I could ask you, Tom, I mean, it seems to me that hard choices are made when people are accountable. If you can blame somebody else,
Right.
then it's easy to walk away from it. And one of the reasons when Roosevelt was fighting war, we actually had a declaration of war because we don't do that anymore.
Right.
Presidents do it on their own. The Congress doesn't want to vote on it. Say, figure it goes south. I'm not accountable to the trillions of dollars spent.
Right, I can criticize it later, yeah.
Presidents like it because they want footprints in the fans of time and they get all the power and the glory when they fight these wars. And that's also true, I think, with regard to the monetary policy. When you were standing up there and speaking, you were saying the Fed should do this or that. You never used the word, well, Congress should come into the equation and maybe they should be having a role here. And I remember the Silver Purchase Act when the big issue was silver and gold standard. And when Congress was forced to vote, they voted against inflating the currency.
Right.
Because they were accountable.
Right.
Then a few years afterwards, then comes in the Fed, the Congress bails out and says, it's your ball.
Right.
So I do think decisions that are forced on institutions to make them accountable will be different. It's said all the time, the Congress is crazy, they're reckless, they won't act stupidly. But that's only because at present, you're deducing when they don't have to be accountable for anything they do.
Well,
We said, you are the ones who are creating the inflation. I think you'd get a different result.
Well, that's certainly a possibility. I think Congress, it would be a new experience for Congress to do that, wouldn't it? I mean, they haven't done it since the Silver Act. Right. So it might work.
Aren't some of your concerns the result of the centralization of control over monetary policy over time? When the Federal Reserve was first thought about during the Taft administration, after the investment bankers had to bail out the government in 1907, the idea was that there would be a much more decentralized board than in fact came about under the Wilson administration. And of course, it's gotten more centralized since. And one of the strengths of the German bank prior to the euro was that the board was fundamentally appointed by the state governments and was relatively impervious to the
centralized
whatever was
politics
in vogue in the national capital.
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly that was considered that's why it's called Federal Reserve rather than central bank originally, and power was distributed, and you know, let's get my biases on the table. I'm a regional guy, and my concern was, and I saw it every time something went wrong. It was the Reserve Bank who messed up, rather than, wait a minute, board staff is in everything. And Silicon Valley is an example. The Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco is to blame. Well, I know for a fact that this was a large enough bank, it was supervised out of DC. That's who's responsible. So we keep centralizing things. And the problem is with centralization is when you do make a mistake, it's bigger. You know, there's no other balance in there. So I'm very much a federalist, and I fought the battle not to see more centralization go, and generally lost. So, but I don't see it going back.
John, a very quick comment here. These are very complex issues and many elements to it, et cetera. But it's really important to try and keep some facts straight.
Right.
Let me highlight two. One, manufacturing output in the United States is at an all-time high. It's never been higher.
Right.
We are not declining in manufacturing output. The other is we have a labor shortage.
Right.
We're not short on jobs. We're short on people to perform them.
Right. I have no disagreement with that. And I hope it stays that way. Is what I can. The only thing I can.
I would just like to comment. We may be producing more manufactured goods, but to meet the demand, we have to import $1 trillion worth of manufactured goods. So that's not relevant, really, to the problem that we have. If we were making that goods here rather than running massive and ongoing trade deficits, our country would be wealthier and our people would have jobs that they would now have been offshored on them.
Well, we may or may not be. It depends on your export situation as well. But we are running a deficit, and the deficit is troublesome. in terms of you can't continue it for, well, it would be difficult to continue it forever. So, yes.
Thank you. I just want to address the points that were just made. And as an economist that studies the economy of education, my comparative analysis and my own research states that the US, compared to Switzerland, is 320 million to 8 million. We are short 9.2 million apprentices in this country. There's your problem right there.
Yeah.
The skills are not here to be able to accommodate the manufacturing that's needed in this country. I'm in the process of launching our first academy here in Washington, D.C. to help to counter that. The first of 55 in this nation, all 50 states and 5 US territories, because somebody has to address the problem. You made the statement at the beginning, if you lead, they will follow. I'm currently at the World Bank and the IMF this week, and they are prepared to follow. So we are chipping away at the problem.
Yeah. If we can find the leadership. Yeah. And I mean, immigration is one of the issues around that too. So, yeah. Yeah.
Tom, you made a comment early on about you do not like QE, and possibly this, you could say the same thing about QT. My question is a very basic one. Is America really best served by having the Fed engage in all of its interest rate manipulation through the FOMC? Might the economy actually function better if we relied upon the financial markets to set interest rates, just as we rely on the markets generally to set prices on a broad range of goods and services in this country?
A fair point. One of my arguments around following price stability only was if you had, we make our rules so complicated, but if you had the simple rule that your mean was, say, 2.25%, and because you look at the long run growth rate of an economy, and you say the most the Fed can do is raise the rates 200 basis points above, or 150 something, I don't care which, and below, and within that, then the rest of it has to be taken care of by the economy itself, right? Because it'll adjust interest rates, supply and demand, savings, and if the government wants to borrow more, interest rates will rise above it, and you can't manipulate your monetary target.
So I have a band, so to speak.
A ban. So some kind of a rule that stops, so that then the market, because capitalism is about cycles. I mean, it is. And when we try and eliminate all cycles, I call the Fed, one thing the Fed's good at is bouncing against the wall. You go too high, then you overreact and go too low, and you overreact and go too high, and you do this, and it doesn't allow the economy to do its job.
As a follow-on to the last question, Milton Friedman, I believe, proposed that in lieu of the gold standard, the Federal Reserve should concentrate on a steady increase in the money supply to impose the same discipline that the gold standard had previously done. Do you think that's feasible?
It's feasible, unlikely to be done because people like to intervene. But the way it would be is how much money you would allow base money to grow each year, and no more than that. And that would also address some of the buying of the government debt. And I think he had like 2 or 3% a year. Basically, I think his comparison was, and there's people in here who may know this a lot better than I, but if you look at the rate of growth of gold over that century, of 19th century, and you were to take that growth rate where we had that with very stable prices, the economy had to adjust on its own, that would be, I think that's where he came up with the 3% or whatever the number was he came up with. So yeah, I think it's possible, but we're not going to do it.
Thank you,
Thank you
so much.
No,
Anybody can come up.
Thank you all. Thank you.